Recovery from Anything features real stories that some listeners might find distressing. Check the show notes for specific content warnings and information on support services.
I think I was trying to pretend like everything was okay. And then I started to internalize the feelings that I was having about the stuff that was going on in my life. It'd be this whole sort of almost obsessive compulsive thing where I could distract myself with the whole process of hating myself, feeling bad, like inside myself.
Welcome to Recovery from Anything. I'm your host, Abby Feltham. Have you ever done something to someone, or even yourself, then the next day thought, wow, I really hate myself for doing that? It's that feeling of shame, the act of internalizing a sense of being fundamentally broken, a bad person who doesn't deserve good things. We are, after all, our own worst critics. For some, perceiving themselves in a negative light could be fleeting. Maybe they messed up at work, or lost their house keys, or spilt spaghetti bolognese down their front. For others, me included, it can be a constant feeling that bubbles under the surface. It's our default state, our factory settings. Rather than liking ourselves for who we are as people, and only berating ourselves when things go wrong, we hate ourselves even when things go right, especially when things go right. I'm pleased to say that my self-esteem has vastly improved compared to what it used to be. I've begun to address the events in my life that instilled in me this belief that I am unworthy of love, which is obviously not true because I'm fabulous. I still struggle, of course, and my therapist has to remind me that my needs are just as important as everyone else's. But I'm not ashamed of the person I am anymore. I recognise that although sometimes I make mistakes, I am not, myself, a mistake. This week's storyteller has embarked on her own journey of negative self-perception. I like this story a lot. And not just because there's a happy ending, but because it shows that the act of recovery doesn't just apply to putting down the drink or stopping a behaviour. It simply means gaining improvement from a previously unwanted state, even if that also includes putting down the drink. Here's Rosa Town.
I grew up in a really small town in Georgia, which is in the southeast of the United States. Kind of your classic strip mall sort of Southern American town. But also there is a university which doubles the town's population when the students are in. Both of my parents worked at the university in the same department as professors of English. So you basically had 90% of the town, which was like your Friday night light, football focused, small town Southern culture. The positive view of it would be sort of salt of the earth, and the negative version would be like the evangelical sort of Baptist Christians. And then like there was this small group of university professors who were academics from, mostly not from Georgia, who had gotten a job at the university there. And sort of in my childhood, most of the kids I spent time with were other university kids. And when I got to school, it was clear that I was not like most other kids because I came from this like very academic family, a bit pretentious in some ways, but also just very, this totally different culture. And I didn't really fit in, and that became really evident when I was going through puberty and being like a tween, basically like 11, 12. I started getting bullied quite badly because I think I was an easy target, and I was an only child too, so I didn't really have like the thick skin that I guess I needed to sort of let it kind of roll like water off a duck's back, Instead, everything was really, I was quite sensitive to everything. So when the bullying really wrapped up, it kind of tangled with all the self-esteem stuff I had going on, like as an early teenager. And I was being bullied for sort of things about myself that I couldn't change, really, like that I was very tall and very skinny, and clothes didn't fit me the way they were supposed to. And it would be for also that I was an atheist. So because it was such a small southern town, Christian or really Baptist communities were kind of the bread and butter of like everybody's social life. Like that was kind of the point, is like you go to church a couple times a week, so Wednesdays and Sundays usually, and you've got youth group and all your friends are there, and there's business connections, and it's kind of like what the whole town revolves around. So if you're not part of that, then people are either A, trying to convert you, or what would happen eventually is they would kind of give up, and then B, bullying me for sort of not being religious enough or not being like them. And that wasn't just the kids, that was also adults as well, who I don't think they realized that it was bullying, but it was sort of institutionalized Christianity, even in the public school system. So really early on, I got this feeling that I didn't really fit in, and that there were things about myself that were wrong or not the right way to be. And I remember feeling like the incredible self-consciousness, which I think a lot of people feel as teenagers, but just the horror of everything, the horror of like every day, of being noticed. Like, I just hope I don't do anything that makes anybody pay attention to me, that makes me a target, that, you know, whatever I can do to hide or whatever, that's what I'll do. I spent a lot of time at the library. I would just go in there like during lunch and stuff, so I like didn't have to be around people, because a lot of the bullying would happen at like unstructured free time stuff, so like at lunch and recess and stuff. So I would like have excuses to get away from things, or like stay behind and be like teacher's pet, cleaning up the classroom kind of things or whatever, or like just anything to kind of get away from the social stuff. I would just basically just wait for school to be over every day, or just immerse myself in other stuff, or just read. I did a lot of reading. There was a real like invalidation of all of that too from my parents. I mean, they did the best they could. I'm lucky because I had two loving parents who they had very poor relationships with their parents, but they did the best they could with me. I really do think that now. But I think the delicate intricacies of the emotions I was feeling from being bullied and not knowing what to do and feeling left out or ostracized or whatever, my mom in particular she just couldn't really understand it, and was sort of like, ignore it or buck up, or yeah, it's a normal part of childhood. But the bullying wasn't normal. And I mean, it's possible that my reaction to that bullying wasn't normal either. It became very quickly, oh, you're very sensitive, Rosa. It became very quickly like me being too sensitive about something. It was never like, this is a bad thing that's happening to you and it shouldn't be this way. It was like you need to be a little bit more thick-skinned and stop reacting like how you are because you're such a sensitive child. And that goes like way back to when I was really little. I was always too sensitive, too anxious. All the funny stories in my family, or funny stories, are all like me doing things that were expressions of my anxiety. Waking up in the middle of the night being like, my heart's beating like really fast. My mom tells this story like it's like really funny, and it's that's something. I mean, just a 7-year-old waking up in the middle of the night like your heart's being really, that's kind of a panic attack. Like, I was having panic attack, and it was like, oh, she's so sensitive, she's so silly. And it was also the same about hypochondriacal kind of stuff, like worrying I was ill and stuff, always sort of played off as like, oh, here she goes again. But the bullying was bad enough that I did leave my school that I was at eventually, because a new school opened up, and it just seemed like a good opportunity for like the last year of middle school to get out of that situation. And I would say that was when things improved quite a bit for me, because that school was basically like all the kids who didn't fit in at other schools, and we were like a ragtag band of misfits, all fit together quite nicely actually. And also the middle school and high school were combined, and that meant that us 14-year-olds, us 8th graders, got to hang out with the much older boys, which worked. I would say it was a mutually beneficial thing going on there, where I had a much older boyfriend quite quickly, which was very exciting. And yeah, I think I started to realize that I could sort of fit into some kind of branch of coolness that maybe didn't have anything to do with the Baptist church or whatever I thought I needed to be. I started off in the marching band, and remarkably, that actually caused me to make a lot of friends because I met loads of people through that. And the high school I went to had like a matriculation from other schools in the area, and those schools had kids whose parents were professors and stuff. So I suddenly was back with a lot of the people that I was with in preschool and stuff when I was like a little kid, kids that I grew up with. And now we were all in the same school together, and it's like we kind of had like a restart or a refresh or whatever. I'd also gotten my braces off, and I'd gotten contact lenses, and things were like better because I looked like a young woman instead of like a nerdy little kid. I just was always dating somebody. It was always somebody older than me. For example, I joined the marching band, and then I was dating the drum major who was a senior, which is like the drum major is like the head of the marching band, but it's a student. He was 17 and I was 14. High school, weirdly, was actually quite good for me. I did band for a bit, but then I was in sports and I did cross country. There's nothing better than being in sports to make you well-liked and accepted by people, because she's an atheist, but she does sports, so she'll be okay. I had a really close boyfriend, a long-term relationship with a boyfriend from sophomore year all the way through the end of high school and then well into college too. My mom really didn't like him, and the problems between my parents really flared up during that time that I was really involved with this guy and paying a lot of attention to him and basically trying to find any opportunity to be with this guy. And meanwhile, things were not going well with my parents. It was clear that stuff wasn't good all the time. Things like there was one time my mom just like stormed out and just like left, and I didn't know where she went, and it really upset me. Again, I kind of hid away. I focused on the relationship that I had. I was obsessed with this guy, like in love with him. And it wasn't mutually sort of reciprocated all the time, which was even more sort of, it's that classic toxic early relationship thing. It's always like someone chasing after the other one or whatever. So it was like very good distraction for what was going on in the rest of my life. I would lose my temper. So my parents said that I had an anger problem. That was what it was defined as. And there'd be lots of like late night discussions about this. And so my temper would flare, and especially with my parents, especially with my dad. Remember, like, I think it was my senior year, so I was 17 or 18, and my mom and I were watching Grey's Anatomy. He turned up in the middle of this Grey's Anatomy episode right before a commercial break when like something really important was happening. It was like standing in the doorway of the den, and he was doing this thing where he was like distracting us, and I just got really upset and was like, stop it, you need to leave because we're watching this, you need to go. And he was doing this like antagonistic thing that he does sometimes as a joke, and I just picked up the remote control and threw it at him, and he dodged it and it hit the floor and it shattered all over the floor. There was like a moment of silence, and I was like waiting for my dad to start yelling at me. And instead, he and my mom started yelling at each other. That's not something I've actually seen before ever, because most of their fighting was like very quiet, very hush hush, but they just like went at each other. And I went out on the back porch, and I remember calling my then boyfriend and was like, I think my parents are divorcing. I think this is what's going to happen. What my dad actually did was he wanted to take me to university. We drove up to Massachusetts from Georgia, and he kind of on the way explained to me that he was going to drive up to Massachusetts with me and then drive west to Seattle, basically that he was going to drop me off at university and then go to the other side of the country and essentially drop me off and leave my mom the same, all in one go. Moving to a new state for the first time in my life, moving to a new place, not knowing what was going on with my parents, not being at home, watching my whole childhood fall apart, my whole like sense of family fall apart. It was devastating. And I honestly think it created the perfect toxic storm for me to get really into drinking. I think that's when that destructive cycle started, honestly, because I was using it as something to forget suddenly. I was able to get alcohol usually one way or another because of that. Like we would have parties like at my place with like handles of vodka, like the giant vodka bottles and stuff. remember we had a Gossip Girl themed party. It was the first party that I got really, really shit-faced in. We went to this house and had this really nice salmon dinner, and it was like this big deal because it was like a fancy dinner, and we all went out together, and then we were going to have this party and dress like the girls from Gossip Girls, and it was going to be all like classy. And so we got really shit-faced, and then the next morning I woke up and sort of cleared everybody out of the room who'd fallen asleep in random places. And then it was raining outside, so I was like, oh, I should probably get my rain boots. And so I went into my closet, and it was like stinking in the closet. And I was like, what is that? And as I got closer to my boots, I was like, oh, I think there's something in my boots. And then I realized that someone had thrown up in my boots. They had thrown up their salmon dinner in my boots, which was like the nastiest smell ever. I spent the entire day being like massively pissed off about it, and then had like a flashbulb memory where I remembered myself throwing up in my boots. So it was definitely me who had done that. And I just remember being like, it was like the first of many experiences where I was like, is this a hilarious story, or is this something's wrong with me? It was like the first time I'd completely blacked out. And I was like, I think I'm just going to like chalk it up to like a funny life experience type story. And then the things that came after that were, it's all the things that happen, unfortunately, to women at that stage in life and at university, or sort of even just like living as a young woman, where the events got worse and worse. They involved being taken advantage of by men who are equally as drunk and blacked out as me. So that makes everything complicated. And there's only so far you can go where you're saying, oh, it's just some funny thing that happened. And I would sort of tell it like it was a funny story, or I'd tell my friends from home, oh yeah, like this, like, oh, you won't believe we got really crazy last weekend. But then there'd be these thoughts like, was I raped? Or did I consent? Or what did I do when I was blacked out? And then, those get worse over time. Those don't like get better. I was trying to live this happy, fun time party girl lifestyle where I was like, yay, I'm happy all the time and I don't care about my parents divorcing. Everybody has divorced parents. And I'm not like heartbroken over my ex that I literally moved to the same state as him so we could hopefully stay together, but he dumped me as soon as summer started. I think I was just trying to pretend like everything was okay. And then I started to internalize the feelings that I was having about the stuff that was going on in my life, and it manifested as hypochondriacal stuff. In my sophomore year, I convinced myself that I had HIV. I was 100% sure. And it was because that was my worst fear, and I felt bad in myself. So I was like, I must have this STI. Like, I must have it. I'd had the flu earlier in the year, so it was like flu-like symptoms. Clearly, I have HIV. And I was like, well, now I need to take the action that I needed to take. So I needed to go to get the blood test and get everything checked out. And it'd be this whole sort of almost obsessive compulsive thing where I could distract myself with the whole process of hating myself, feeling bad, like inside myself, and then convincing myself it was because I was physically ill because of something I had done to myself, which is like sleeping with somebody that, made me ill or whatever. Funny because I would go to the doctor, and then it happened enough times that I got these tests. At one point they were like, you do not have an STI. You are okay. Like, go away. Like, stop getting these tests. You're fine. So, and I got like offered counseling and stuff too, because I think they were like, there is something else going on here, which there was. I was upset about my parents divorcing, which is clearly what was going on. I think I just couldn't kind of cope with that. And everybody else was seeing that around me and like seeing that something was wrong with me. But I kind of thought, because there's something damaged and broken about me. That's what's causing this. And the only thing that made me feel better was drinking. Alcohol was very effective at stopping those intrusive thoughts that I had go around and around and around and around and around. Alcohol made me feel like I can be anybody I want to be. I am the best person ever. I remember many, many times like going to a pub, having my first beer in the pub, and then like going down to use the bathroom and then looking at myself in the mirror and being like, wow, you look so much better than you thought you did. Like, you look really good. Like, you're amazing. Look at you. Just feeling like I could manufacture that self-esteem in like a blink of an eye. That was great, especially when things were particularly bad for me. That was when it was effective. But the insidious, difficult thing about it was that it wasn't always that way for me. It wasn't a clear-cut thing. I heard somebody describe it once as like Russian roulette drinking, where you're okay most of the time, but then every now and then you get that like one bullet that's in the chamber and you stay out until 4 o'clock in the morning and lose your glasses and scrape your face against the floor at a summer party or whatever, or like sleep with your colleague or, whatever the embarrassing thing is. And you can never predict when it is because it feels random. My final college boyfriend was a very heavy drinker, and I was keeping pace with him. He made drinking cool. It was like a hipster type of drinking, like a cool sort of dive bar, like, mimosas in the morning. He had like amazing like tattoos, and he's the reason why I have like a giant tattoo on my leg. I absolutely love this guy and moved to Seattle to be with him. I basically did a geographic and was like, oh, if I move to the West Coast, I can live with my new hipster boyfriend and we can live happily ever after. Even the summer before I moved, I was already doing stuff. Like, you want to talk about destructive behavior. Like, I was in love with this guy. I'd left another boyfriend for him. He was like my dream guy or whatever. And then the moment I was away from him for like 2 weeks at the summer camp that I worked at, I'd already like cheated on him. Like, I'd gotten drunk and hooked up with some other guy. Which then would make me feel like, oh, I'm a horrible person because all I do ever is get drunk and cheat, because the real me has no integrity and the real me comes out when I drink. That was kind of the message that I had in my mind. In order to do the things that I feel like I need or I want to do, I have to drink to enable myself to access those things. And so it was like this cycle of like, I don't feel fulfilled. I don't feel like I'm getting what I need. And I know rationally it's the wrong thing to do. So I'm going to drink so then I can justify my own bad behavior. And then you can see how that's cyclical, because then you wake up after drinking. You're like, oh, I can't believe I did that horrible thing. I guess I'll drink and then I won't have to think about it again. Later that summer, we moved out to Seattle together, and I confessed that I had slept with someone else, because that was often the thing that I would sort of like self-castigate, self-punish. Now I must confess to you what I have done so that you can treat me like I feel like I deserve to be treated, which is to be hated. And then he stayed with me. It was like, ugh, and the relationship just kind of crumbled, of course. In Seattle, I was drinking pretty heavily, but it's a very heavy drinking city. And I was aware that I was a heavier drinker, but not an alcoholic. When I started dating Peter, my husband, there's some stuff now looking back that I can see my behavior was problematic. When we first started dating, he was kind of noticing that we'd come back from the night out and I'd fall asleep on the toilet, which I had never, to my knowledge, I'd never done before. But he's Irish and he would drink quite heavily, and then I would drink quite heavily with him, keep pace like I like to do. I would like come home and regularly come home and fall asleep and like snore on the toilet, like like sitting up, like it's not glamorous. There was a time we went out for St. Patrick's Day and I fell asleep at the table and then was like kicked out of the bar. As I got up and as I was being kicked out, I threw up all over myself, all over the floor. These things would keep happening that were indications that I was out of control. Driving drunk, of course. Like the American reality is that many people drive drunk and it's horrible, but I did. And I got lucky that I didn't hurt anyone or get a DUI, but I could have really easily. It was just like thing after thing after thing after thing. And then I did another geographic, which was like, oh, well, I'm miserable. So I need to move to England because that will fix things. Because once in 2008, I had a great time in London when I visited. So I'm going to see if I can get into this master's degree, and then did get into it and was like, okay, that's where I'm going.
Mind the gap between the train and the platform. This is
brought Peter along with me. We'd only been together for like less than a year, and he came with me. Yeah, and it's just the drinking culture here is just it's a different ball game, really. And plus I was arriving here in debt with no real money, not with a job, in school. Peter had no job either, no career. We basically just tried to make it here, and I immediately just felt quite lonely. I guess it was like a bit of culture shock, but also like felt again like I was just so intensely different from everybody else and othered, and that I didn't have, this core group of people, like a core group of friends or family. I mean, that takes a long time to build up. You're not going to arrive in a new country with no family and suddenly have like a core group of friends. Like, it doesn't work like that. But it was just hard for me to break into it here in particular. And I found like the only way I could get like social camaraderie was through drinking with people. That's what I thought at the time. And it just spiraled. It was like the perfect storm of not having very much money, feeling totally lost and adrift. I was really lonely, and our relationship suffered because of the alcohol. So it was like me trying to get away from our relationship, and then me feeling unfulfilled and wanting to find somebody to look at me in the way that I couldn't look at myself, to find some good in me. You look in other people's eyes, especially for me, men's eyes, to see love that you can't feel for yourself, to see affection. Who do you want me to be tonight, to be this person that I wish I could be? You have to completely externally locate that approval in order to feel any sense of self-worth. So yeah, that was quite a dark place for me, because meanwhile I was, finishing my master's degree, like getting married to my extremely understanding and patient husband. Everything looked like it was all okay from the outside. And meanwhile, on the inside, I felt like I was crumbling, completely disintegrating. It hit an all-time low in 2018. I was having sort of physical health problems. I was having like bladder infections, like recurrent ones that I was basically always on antibiotics for. And I would get sick and then stay sick for a really long time. Like, my immune system was just like crushed. I was taking the specific antibiotic that you could take and drink at the same time. Like, I would call the doctor, request that particular antibiotic because I knew what was wrong with me, or I thought I knew what was wrong with me. And they would just prescribe it, like, yeah, you probably have another like UTI or whatever. Being permanently on antibiotics, like, that's bad on multiple levels. And I just remember being so unwell. And then it was like the only time I could feel okay was drinking again. That was how I could stop feeling so unwell, is to have a few drinks and then feel like normal for a little bit. It was definitely like rock bottom. It was definitely like suicidal kind of stuff. I didn't ever make a plan, but it did get to the point where I was starting to think it'd probably be better if I wasn't here, and it would be better if I just didn't wake up, like all that kind of stuff. The last time I drank, and the sort of the fallout from that, because it wasn't my lowest point, but it was one of many stupid drinking experiences where I'd done all kinds of like horrible stuff, and then the next morning it was like dealing with all the fallout of that. The way I remember it is I had woken up and something had just cracked or clicked or whatever, a switch had flipped, whatever you want to say. I don't actually know what it was, but something had happened that morning where I woke up and was like, that's it. That's enough. And it was the first day that I was like, I have a problem. I didn't call myself an alcoholic, but I was like, I have it. It's literally the first step. I was like, I'm powerless over alcohol. I was like, yeah, this is out of control. I have a problem. I need help. That was the main thing. Because once I talked Peter into not leaving me right away, I was like, give me 1 month. And he's like, I've heard this before. And I was like, no, this is different this time. Like, this is different. And I convinced him to, begrudgingly stick around for a month, thank God. I came back to the house, and my dad and stepmom were with us. We were in Berlin. And My stepmom had been sober at that point for like 10 years, and my dad had been living with her as a sober person for like 10 years. And when I came and told them, I have a drinking problem, I think I have a problem, and I need help, they just immediately believed me, which was like terrifying, but also really validating. They were also relieved because I think my stepmom had known for a long time that I had a drinking problem. I'd talked to her about how I'd had trouble controlling my drinking before and blah, blah, blah. I'd sort of like tested the waters. But it wasn't a big deal. It was like, okay, yeah, thanks for telling us. Yeah, we can deal with it. It was terrifying, but it was a massive relief. I just remember later that day, we went out to eat dinner before I headed back to London, and my dad and my husband, Peter, both of them got beers at this place. And I remember looking at their beers and being like, I have made a grave mistake. Like, I have made a big mistake. But I didn't drink, and it's literally was I just kept not drinking after that. And it was super difficult at the beginning, but it does get easier. And it was literally just every time I had the opportunity to drink, I just didn't. And I still don't. I do see drinking in that way as a form of self-harm. And it was for me as well, because it was a way to cope as well with overwhelming emotions that I was having, whether that was loneliness or even happiness or any sort of major feeling that I had. It was a way to sort of either to numb it or just to manage it, really. Once I got sober, that was the thing that I really needed counseling for, which I was able to access counseling. My GP put me into a recovery center thing, and I got like a key worker and counseling through that. And that was actually brilliant because it came at exactly the right time, right after I'd gotten sober, when I was just having to like literally live life on life's terms, which I was not coping with very well. And I just was carrying all the shame still, all the shame from drinking, so much of it. And so much of it was like crushing me, and I didn't even realize it until I talked about it with a counselor who just listened to me and was like, yeah, that's like, you're not a bad person. It was like, oh, it's like you just show something to the light and it loses all of its power. And I realized like how many different things I had been holding from stuff that I'd done while I was drinking, stuff that I'd felt about things. I was just holding all this shame that had been driving the cycle. And that was what broke it, I think, is realizing that all those things I had done while I was drinking, they didn't like make me a bad person, which in my head I remember that spring being amazed by like stuff that I hadn't ever been that interested in before. Just noticing stuff like flowers and noticing like the sky. There was like a rediscovery of kind of some of the things that I had really liked as a kid. I was starting to get to know myself again, and that was good, but it was also still, I was still pretty much white knuckling it still, which is what led me at the end of that year, 2019, to seek out AA for the first time properly. And then early 2020, we all know what happened later on in 2020, but I was going to meetings sort of in person during the early part of 2020 and late part of 2019. And that was when I was able to access AA properly and actually really enjoyed that, and was like feeling like I could meet other people who were struggling with similar things. And yeah, it's definitely like ups and downs. It's not a linear thing. I'm not perfect. I'm not like living a perfect life right now, but it's a much better life than I was living, in 2018. And I don't hate myself anymore. And I have a better sense of self. And it does get easier. The tendency to want to drink to cope with stuff will always be with me my whole life. And I have to be aware of that. But it becomes easier to bear. Like, it has become easier for me to bear that. I feel cautiously optimistic. I think in general, I do feel things are okay. They're okay enough. They're okay enough, and I'm content with the way things are. And yeah, I think I'm definitely less like looking way, way ahead in the future or like coveting stuff like the way that I used to, and sort of thinking, okay, I am happy to sit with myself, with the person who I am now, and it doesn't feel like squirmy like how it used to. So that took a lot of time, but I'm okay with the person who I am. I know that I'm a good person, quote unquote. I don't think the things I used to think about myself, which is a big change for me, because that used to be constant berating in my head of like the person I was. I don't have that like fear that I had to of like becoming the worst version of myself or something like that I used to have. I don't feel like that's something I have to worry about, because like I'm just me. Recovery means, well, I would say it's a sort of a state of being. It's not an end goal. You don't achieve recovery that you're in recovery. Before I got sober, I used to find that idea horrible. Like something that lasts forever just seemed horrible. Ugh, no, gross. But being in recovery for me is that I don't need to have something to make it okay to live my life. I can just be, and I can just live my life the way I want to live it on my terms. And I don't need to have something external to make me be able to cope with it. That I'm enough.
You've been listening to Recovery from Anything. I'm your host, Abby Feltham. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review the show, and join the community on Instagram at Recovery from Anything. You can find out more about this week's storyteller or submit a story of your own on our website, recoveryfromanything.com. Thank you for listening.